Good morning everyone. Today I just want to do a quick little video on time lapses using the Nikon mirrorless cameras. This is the built-in time-lapse function, so not using the time-lapse method where you take lots of individual images and then put them together using a different software program. This is the quick in-camera system where you can take stunning time lapses like the ones you've just seen and put them out straight away. It records them as a .mov file or MP4 file. This is done in camera, in body. Can't edit them unfortunately. However, you do have the time lapses ready to go and ready made. So I'm going to show you how to do that in camera if you own a Nikon mirrorless camera. Okay, I'm going to show you just a quick little run through on how to set up your camera for the time-lapse movie function. And this is to shoot time lapses in camera so that when it is done shooting, you have a movie ready to go. You can share with friends, share on your social media, already made in camera. And this is great. I use this a lot when shooting B-roll or behind the scenes with my camera while I'm scouting different locations. So this setting is available on some of the older DSLRs, not on all of them. However, it is available on all of the new mirrorless cameras. So if you have a Z series camera, Nikon camera, you should have the time-lapse movie function. So first thing you're going to do is go into your menu. You're going to go down to a photo shooting menu. You're going to scroll all the way down. It's near the bottom, and you're going to look for the setting called time-lapse movie. Then you're going to select this and it's going to show you a whole bunch of settings, and we're just going to run through them. I'm going to show you how to set them up optimally so you can get nice and smooth time lapses like I do in all of my videos. So when you're in the time-lapse movie setting, you'll see there are settings such as interval, shooting time, exposure, smoothing, silent photography. I'm just going to run through all of those quickly. But the most important thing is if you look at the bottom, you'll see the bar and some numbers, and what that's doing is based on the settings you use for the top settings, it'll tell you how long the time lapse will be that it'll make. So this is really important because you can punch in all your settings and it'll tell you it's going to make a 10-second time lapse or a 2-minute time lapse, and then this will give you a good gauge of whether that's long enough for what you want, and also tell you if you put in the correct settings to get a decent time lapse. So the first thing you're going to go to is the interval, and this is the time between each photo. So the longer the interval time, the faster your time lapse is going to run. So if you set up a time lapse with 30-second interval, you're going to need to shoot over many hours to get a very short time lapse, and that shows a big portion of time that has elapsed. So the longer the interval, the faster or more sped up the time lapse will appear. So this is great for if you're doing like stars, Milky Way moving across the sky, anything that moves really slowly, you want to have a bigger interval time. Anything that's moving really fast, like cars driving, wind blowing clouds, you want to have a relatively short interval time so that you can capture that motion and not miss out on it. So when I'm shooting time lapses, I generally set a 1 second to 3 second interval, and this will be for cloud movement. So if I'm shooting a sunset and the clouds are moving in really fast, or the fog's coming in over a lion's head, as in the images and videos I showed earlier, I will put a 1 second or a 2 second interval. If the clouds are moving very slowly, then I'll go to like a 3 second or 4 second, but I don't normally go much longer than that. So if I'm shooting the sun moving across the sky or something like that, I'll go for a 30-second or 1 minute interval if I want to get something that's quite slow moving sped up. So you'll select interval now, and then you'll pop in your interval time that you want to have. I'll set mine to 3 or 4 seconds, like I said, and then you'll go to your total shooting time. So this will be how long do you want the time lapse to run for. So if you know you're going to be at the location for 30 minutes and you want to get a time lapse, you'll set your time lapse window to 30 minutes or 40 minutes, or if you want to do a much longer one, you can do 3 hours. But this is the total time you're going to take to record the time lapse. I generally always set the shooting time longer than I need. You can stop it earlier, but when you're shooting a sunset or cloud movement, you're not sure if it's going to get better with time. You don't want the time lapse to end early in the middle of some epic color in the sky. So I will generally set this for longer. So if I want about a 20-minute shooting time, I'll set it for 30 minutes or 40 minutes. And if nothing happens after 20 minutes, I'll just stop it manually by pressing the OK button. So always a good idea to set the shooting time longer. However, if you're going to set up your camera and leave it and not be with it and you want it to stop at a certain time, that's perfectly fine. You can set it for your 30 minutes or 40 minutes. And then once you've set this with the interval, if you look at the bottom bar, it'll tell you how long the time lapse will be for those settings that you've put in. So it'll say if you set up a 2-second interval with a 30-minute time lapse, it will give you a 40-second time lapse or something like that. So that's a nice indicator to tell you how long the time lapse will be as well. So make sure you look at those numbers in that bottom bar. The next step is enable or disable exposure smoothing. If the aim of your video is to use it straight out of camera, which should be your intention for these type of time lapses, it's best to enable exposure smoothing. Exposure smoothing is great if you have changing light conditions. So if clouds are coming in and out, if you're shooting from daylight into evening at sunset, or vice versa for sunrise, if you have a lot of changing light, the exposure smoothing in camera on the Nikon cameras is absolutely brilliant. And I absolutely love this feature. So please enable exposure smoothing unless you know precisely why you want to disable it. The next thing is enable or disable silent photography. This is a personal choice. I just enable it so I don't have to hear the clicking of the camera in the background, but some people like that, so you can have that on and or off. Okay, the next option is choosing the image area. If you're shooting on the crop sensor cameras like the Z50, you won't have this option. You'll only be able to shoot in DX in the crop sensor size. However, if you are shooting full frame, you'll have the option to use the full sensor size, and I would recommend going with the FX, the full frame area, for your time lapse, and you can always crop later if you want to. Then for frame size and rate, this really depends on what you intend to use the video for. You can shoot a 4K at 30 frames per second and at 1080p at 60 frames per second. I generally shoot for my time lapses, because I don't plan to speed them up or slow them down, at 4K 30 frames per second. This means I'm not using that much space. I'm getting as much quality as I want, but I'm using a 30 frame rate. But I'm using a frame rate of 30 frames per second. But this just really depends on the video output you want. If you're just shooting it for something small for social media, you can get away with 1080p at 30 frames per second, and you're not using a lot of your card space when shooting these time lapses. Okay, the next setting is interval priority option. I generally turn this off. This really depends on the type of time lapse you're shooting. This will only really affect if you are shooting it on aperture priority, and it will change your exposure to go longer than your interval, and then you will say, I want my interval to be prioritized over my exposure time. So it'll basically start cutting the exposures, and your image will get darker and darker into sunset. But for 90% of all your time lapses where you don't have a massive degree of light variation, you can turn interval priority off. The next setting is whether the camera focuses for each shot. I always turn this off, because once my camera is focused, especially for landscapes, there's no need to refocus for every shot. The only thing I could think where this would be useful is if you are focused on something and shooting a time lapse on a specific object that is slowly moving towards you, or something like a plant growing or something like that, where you may need it to refocus because the leaf is moving in or out of frame after each shot. But generally I turn this off, because you are adding other factors, and if it misses focus, you can mess up your time lapse. So turn it off if you're shooting landscapes, anything like that for time lapses, and only turn on the focus between each shot if there's a specific reason, such as your focus point moving in or out of frame. Okay, lastly, once you've set all these settings up, you'll go back to the time-lapse movie setting, and you will go up to start, and you will click OK on start. Many people, I don't know, for some reason on the camera will click the shutter button to start and nothing happens, and they just take a photo and they're like, where's my time lapse? For this particular function, you got to go up to the top of the menu where it says start and actively select start. And then you'll see the little green light on the back of your screen will slowly start to flash on and off while it is shooting. So if you walk away and you see a little green light flickering on the back of your Nikon camera, this is a good thing. It means your time lapse is working and is a good indicator to know that everything is happening. It's a great function for shooting B-roll content, and you don't have to spend hours afterwards post-processing all your raw files to get a time lapse. You have it straight out of camera.